Chapter 9. The Arm of Power. Lawler stayed long enough at the Circle L to speak a word with his mother. His sister Mary had gone to bed when he stepped into the front door of the ranch house to be greeted by Mrs. Lawler, who had heard him cross the porch, recognized his step, and had come to meet him. He smiled at her, but there was a stiffness about his lips and a cold, whimsical light in his eyes that told her much. She drew a deep breath and smiled faintly. "You have disagreed with Gary Warden," she said. "He will not keep Leffingwell's agreement." "Said he never heard of any agreement," said Lawler. "I rode in to tell the boys to hold the herd here until I got back from the capital. I'm going to see the railroad commissioner about cars. Simmons says there isn't a car in the state. If we can't get cars, we'll drive to Red Rock." He took her face in his hands and patted her cheeks gently. "Blackburn will probably bed the trail herd down on the Rabbit Ear. I'm joining him there, and then I'm going to the Capitol in the morning." Mrs. Lawler was standing on the porch when he mounted Red King. She was still standing there when Lawler looked back after he had ridden half a mile. Lawler found Blackburn and the herd on the Rabbit Ear, as he had anticipated. The Rabbit Ear was an insignificant creek that intersected the Wolf at a distance of about 15 miles from the Circle L, and the outfit had selected for a camp a section of plain that ran to the water's edge. It was a spot that had been used before by the men of the outfit, and when Lawler rode up, the men were stretched out in their blankets around a small fire. Blackburn grinned wickedly when informed of Gary Warden's refusal to keep Leffingwell's agreement. "Didn't I hit him right?" he sneered. "I aim to be able to tell a coyote first pop whether he is sneakin' in the sagebrush or settin' in office. They ain't no difference. No cars, eh? Bah, if you say the word, me and the boys'll hit the breeze to town and run Warden and Simmons out. You're wastin' your time. Goin' to see Morgan Hatfield, the commissioner. Don't I know him? He tin-horned over at Lascar for 2 or 3 years before he got into politics. And now he is tin-hornin' the cattle owners of the state. He'll grin that Chessie, cat grin of his and tell you he can't do nothin', and he'll do it. Bah, this country is going plumb to hell. Any country will, when there is too much law hanging around loose." He scowled and looked hard at Lawler. "We'll hold him at Willits, all right, and regular, until you give us the word to hit the Tom Long Trail. But while you're gone, I'm getting ready to travel. For there won't be any cars, Lawler, and don't you forget it." Lawler said nothing in reply to Blackburn's vitriolic speech. So unperturbed did he seem that Blackburn remarked to one of the men, after Lawler wrapped himself in a blanket and stretched out near the fire, that "the more Lawler's got on his mind, the less he talks." Long before dawn, Lawler saddled up and departed. When Blackburn awoke and rubbed his eyes, he cast an eloquent glance at the spot where Lawler had lain, grinned crookedly, and remarked to the world at large, "Anyway, we're back in his play to the limit, and don't you forget it." Lawler left Red King at the stable from which, the day before, Gary Warden had ridden on his way to the Hamlin cabin, and when the westbound train steamed in, he got aboard, waving a hand to the friends who, the day before in the Willits Hotel, had selected him as their spokesman. It was afternoon when Lawler stepped from the train in the Capitol. He strode across the paved floor of the train shed, through a wide iron gate and into a barber shop that adjoined the waiting room. There he gave himself to the care of a barber who addressed him as Mr. Lawler in a voice of respect. "I've shaved you before, Mr. Lawler," said the man. "I think it was when you was down here last year, to the convention. I heard the speech you made that time, nominating York Faulkner for governor. Too bad you didn't run yourself. You'd have made it, saving the state from the tree toad, which is hanging to it now." During his short stay at the Circle L the night before, Lawler had changed from his cowboy rigging to a black suit of civilian cut, with tight trousers that were stuffed into the tops of soft boots of dull leather. The coat was long, after the fashion of the period, cut square at the bottom, and the silk lapels matched the flowing tie that was carelessly bowed at the collar of a shirt of some soft white material. He wore a black felt hat, and out of consideration for the custom and laws of the Capitol, he had shoved his 6-shooter around so that it was out of sight on his right hip. However, The cartridge-studded belt was around his waist. He kept the black coat buttoned over it, hiding it. He had been in the Capitol often and had no difficulty in finding his way to the Capitol building. It was at the intersection of two wide streets, a broad, spacious structure of white stone, standing in the center of a well-kept grass plot. It was imposing, hinting of the greatness of the state that had erected it, suggesting broadness of vision and simple majesty. The state was not at fault, Lawler reflected as he mounted the broad stone stairs that led upward to the interior of the building. The state was founded upon principles that were fundamentally just, and the wisdom of the people, their resources, their lives, were back of it all. This building was an expression of the desire of the people. It represented them. It was the citadel of government from which came the laws to which they bowed. It was the visible arm of power. Lawler crossed the big rotunda, where the light was subdued, and walked down a wide corridor, pausing before a door on which was the legend, State Railroad Commissioner. A few minutes later, after having given his name to an attendant, he was standing in a big, well-lighted and luxuriously furnished room, hat in hand, looking at a tall, slender man who was seated in a swivel chair at a big, flat-top desk. The man was older than Lawler, much older. The hair at his temples was almost white, but heavy and coarse. An iron-gray wisp straggled over his brow where he had run a hand through it. Apparently, his eyes were gray keen, with a light in them that hinted of a cold composure equal to that which gleamed in Lawler's. The long, hooked nose, though, gave the eyes an appearance of craftiness, and the slightly downward droop at the corners of his mouth suggested cynicism. He smiled, veiling an ironic flash in his eyes by drooping the lids as he spoke to his visitor. "Hello, Lawler," he said, smiling faintly. "Take a chair." He waved a hand toward one on the side of the desk opposite him. "It has been a long time since you struck town, hasn't it?" "Since the last state convention, eh?" There was a hint of laughter in his voice, a suggestion of mockery in the unspoken inference that he remembered the defeat of Lawler's candidate. Lawler smiled. "Well, you did beat us. That is a fact, Hatfield. There is no use denying that. But we took our medicine, Hatfield. You had to," grinned the other. "Whenever the people of a state," Hatfield interrupted Lawler gravely, "it seems to me that the people of this state are always taking medicine. Political medicine, that is what I have come to talk with you about." Hatfield's smile faded. His eyes gleamed coldly. "What is wrong, Lawler? It is cars, Hatfield, or rather no cars," he added grimly. "Usually, at this season of the year, there will be 100 or 2 empty cars on the siding at Willits, with other hundreds on the way. This year the siding is empty, and J. Simmons says there are no cars to be had. He tells me there isn't an empty car in the state. Caldwell of the Star, and Barthman, Littlefield, Courts, Sigmund, and Lester, who are ranch owners near Willits, told me to come down here and ask you what can be done. I'm asking you." Hatfield eyed Lawler steadily as the latter talked. His gaze did not waver as Lawler concluded, but a slight stain appeared in his cheeks, which instantly receded, leaving them normal again. But that slight flush betrayed Hatfield to Lawler. It told Lawler that Hatfield knew why there were no cars. And Lawler's eyes chilled as his gaze met Hatfield's. "I've talked that matter over with the railroad people several times," said Hatfield in an impersonal, snapping voice. "They tell me that you cattle owners are to blame. You seem to think that it is the business of the railroad company to guess how many cars you will want. You wait until the roundup is over before you begin to think about cars, and then you want them all in a bunch. You are mistaken, Hatfield. Along about the middle of the season, every prudent cattle owner arranges with a buyer or with the railroad company for the necessary cars. In my case, I made arrangements with Jim Leffingwell, the buyer at Willits, as long ago as last spring. But Leffingwell isn't buyer anymore, and Gary Warden, the present buyer, refuses to recognize my agreement with Leffingwell. A written agreement? Unfortunately not. Leffingwell's word was always good. Hatfield's smile was very near a sneer. If you neglect the rudiments of business, it seems to me that you have only yourselves to blame. in your case. Lawler, it is rather astonishing. You have quite a reputation for intelligence. You own one of the biggest ranches in the state. You are wealthy. And last year you tried to tell the people of the state how to run it. You even went so far as to make a speech in the convention, naming the man you preferred for governor. Lawler smiled, though his gaze was level. Don't be unpleasant, Hatfield. You understand. I am not here as a politician, but as a mere citizen petitioning you to act in this railroad case. What I have done or said has no bearing on the matter at all. The railroad company will not provide cars in which to ship our stock east, and I am here to ask you to do something about it. Hatfield appeared to meditate. Warden offered to buy your cattle, you say? Lawler nodded, but he had not mentioned to Hatfield that Warden had offered to buy the cattle. Hatfield had either surmised that or had received information through other sources. Lawler suspected that the railroad commissioner had been informed through the various mediums at his command, and this was evidence of collusion. And Simmons says there are no cars, mused Hatfield. Well, that seems to leave you shippers in a bad predicament, doesn't it? Can't you drive to some other point where you can arrange to get cars? 500 miles to Red Rock over the Tom Long Trail, the worst trail in the country. What price could you get at Red Rock? The market price, about $30. And what did Warden offer? $25. It seems to me, considering the inconvenience of driving over the Tom Long Trail, you'd be better off taking Warden's offer. It is remarkable to what lengths you cattle owners will go for a few dollars. $5 a head on a herd of 8,000 amounts to $40,000, Hatfield. Lawler reminded him. Hatfield, this isn't a question of dollars. It is a question of principle. This situation is a result of a scheme to hold up the cattle owners of the state. It is mighty plain. The railroad company refuses cars to the cattle owners, but will supply them to buyers like Warden. The buyers must have some assurance of getting cars, or they wouldn't buy a single hoof. What we want is to force the railroad to supply cattle owners with cars. Why not hold your stock over the winter? Suggested Hatfield, with a faint half-smile. Hatfield, you know that can't be done. There isn't a cattle owner in the country who is prepared to winter his stock. Had we known this situation was to develop, we might have laid in some feed, though that is an expensive method. Nothing has been done, for we expected to ship by rail as usual. Almost every owner has a stock of feed on hand, but that is for breeders and for other stock that doesn't grade up. If we are forced to winter our stock on the ranges, half of them would die of starvation and exposure before spring. Hatfield narrowed his eyes and studied Lawler's face. He half pursed his lips for a smile, but something in the grave, level eyes that looked into his dissuaded him, and he frowned and cleared his throat. It looks mighty bad for a fact, he said. The buyers seem to have you owners in something of a pocket. The worst of it is that the thing is general. I have complaints from all over the state. The railroad people say there is nothing they can do. I've taken it up with them. The explanation they offer is that during the summer they sent most of their rolling stock east to take care of an unprecedented demand there, for some reason or other, which they don't attempt to explain. The cars haven't been coming back as they should. It looks to me, Lawler, like you owners are in for a bad winter. What about the law, Hatfield? Can't we force them to supply cars? Hatfield's smile came out. It was sarcastic. The wise law makers of the state, who gave the railroad company a franchise, neglected to provide a punitive clause. There isn't a tooth in the law. I've looked it over from one end to the other, and so has the Attorney General. This office is helpless. Lawler, I would advise you to accept the offer of your resident buyer. It may be that those fellows have an agreement with the railroad company, but we haven't any evidence, and without evidence we couldn't do anything, even if there were teeth in the law. Lawler smiled and went out. As the door closed behind him, Hatfield sank back into his chair and chuckled gleefully. Swallowed it, he said in an undertone, swallowed it whole, and that is the guy I was most afraid of. Lawler walked down the big corridor, across the rotunda, and into another corridor to the door of the governor's office. As he passed through the rotunda, he was aware that several persons congregated there watched him curiously, and he heard one of them say, guardedly, That is Kane Lawler of Wolf River. He'd have been governor right now if he'd said the word last fall. Biggest man in the state. There was truth in the man's words, though Lawler reddened when he heard them. 3 times in the days preceding the convention, which had nominated Perry Houghton, the present governor, delegations from various sections of the state had visited Lawler at the Circle L, endeavoring to prevail upon him to accept the nomination. And one day the editor of the most important newspaper in the capital had journeyed to the Circle L to add his voice to the argument advanced by the delegations. But Lawler had refused because previously to their visits he had given his word to York Faulkner, and he had championed Faulkner's candidacy with such energy and enthusiasm that in the end, on the day of the convention, his name was better known than that of his candidate. And at the last minute the convention was in danger of stampeding to him, threatening to nominate him, despite his protests. He had been forced to tell them plainly that he would not serve if nominated and elected, because he had pledged his support to Faulkner. And Faulkner, at home in a distant county while the convention was in session, remained silent, refusing to answer the frantic requests that he withdraw in favor of Lawler. That attitude had defeated Faulkner, as his loyalty to his friend had increased his popularity. Now, pausing before the door of the governor's office, Lawler was aware of the completeness of the sacrifice he had made for Faulkner. His face paled, his eyes glowed, and a thrill ran over him at this moment. If he had not made the sacrifice, he might have been sitting in the governor's office, listening to Caldwell, or Sigmund, or others from his own section, perhaps from other sections of the state, advising them, seeking to help them. For one thing, Morgan Hatfield would not have been his railroad commissioner. As it was, he was going to enter the governor's office as a mere petitioner, not sure of his reception. For Perry Houghton had beaten Faulkner and owed Lawler nothing. Indeed, after his election, Houghton had referred sarcastically to Lawler. When Lawler found himself in the presence of the governor, he was in a grimly humorous mood. For despite the sarcastic flings he had directed at Lawler, the governor ponderously arose from a big chair at his desk and advanced to meet him, a hand outstretched. "Hello, Lawler," he said. "Glad to see you. Where have you been keeping yourself?" Lawler shook the governor's hand. Not replying to the effusive greeting, Lawler smiled, though, and perhaps the governor saw in the smile an answer to his question. He led Lawler to a chair and returned to his own, where he sat, leaning back, watching his visitor with a speculative gaze. Perry Houghton was a big, florid man with sleek, smooth manners, a bland smile, and an engaging eye, which held a deep gleam of insincerity. The governor posed as a genial, generous, broad-minded public official, and it had been upon that reputation that he had been nominated and elected. But the geniality had been adopted for political reasons. The real man was an arrogant autocrat, lusting for power and wealth. He disliked Lawler, feared him. Also, since the convention he had felt vindictive toward Lawler, for Lawler had offended him by his tenacious championship of Faulkner. He had almost lost the nomination through Lawler's efforts. "Been in town long?" he queried. "Just long enough to have a talk with Hatfield." The governor smiled wanly. "Hatfield has been having his troubles, Lawler. An unprecedented situation has developed in the state. The railroad company seems to be unable to supply cars for cattle shipments. We have investigated, and so far we have been unable to discover whether the shortage is intentional or accidental. Whatever the cause, it is a bad situation. Very bad. We've got to take some action. Whatever action you take ought to be immediate." "Governor," said Lawler, "the roundup is over and cattle must move. That is why I am here, to ask you what can be done. I have taken the matter up with the Attorney General Lawler. The law is vague and indefinite. We can't proceed under it. However, we are going to pass new laws at the next session of the legislature. That will be in January," said Lawler. "Half the cattle in the state will starve before that time." The governor flushed. "That is the best we can do, Lawler." "Why not call a special session, Governor?" Houghton laughed. "Do you keep yourself informed, Lawler?" he said, a suspicion of mockery in his voice. If you do, you will remember that the legislature has just adjourned after acting upon some important matters. This matter is important enough to demand another session immediately," declared Lawler. The governor cleared his throat and gazed steadily at Lawler, his eyes gleaming with a vindictive light that he tried to make judicial. "As a matter of fact, Lawler, this question of shipping cattle is not as important as you might think, to the state at large, that is. If you take all the packing out of the case, you will find at the bottom that it is merely a disagreement between cattle owners and cattle buyers. It seems to me that it is not a matter for state interference. As I understand, the cattle buyers have offered a certain price. The owners ask another, and the owners want the state to force the buyers to pay their price. I can't see that the state has any business to meddle with the affair at all. The state can't become a clearinghouse for the cattle industry. We are not asking the state to act in that capacity, Houghton. We want the state to force the railroad company to provide cars. It can't be done, Lawler. There is no provision in the law under which we can force the railroad company to provide cars." Lawler laughed mirthlessly and got to his feet, crossing his arms over his chest and looking down at the governor. For a time, there was silence in the big room, during which the governor changed color several times and drooped his eyes under Lawler's grimly humorous gaze. Then Lawler spoke. "All right, Houghton," he said. "I'll carry your message back to my friends at Willits. I'll also carry it to Leif Renwick of the news here in the capital. We'll make it all plain enough so that your position won't be misunderstood. The railroad company is not even a resident corporation, and yet you, as governor, refuse to act in the interests of the state cattle owners against it, merely to force it to play fair. This will all make interesting conversation and more interesting reading. My visit here has proved very interesting and instructive. Good day, sir." He strode out, leaving Houghton to glare after him. 10 minutes later, he was in the editorial office of the News, detailing his conversation with Hatfield and the governor to a keen-eyed man of 35 named Metcalf, who watched him intently as he spoke. At the conclusion of the visit, the keen-eyed man grinned. "You've started something, Lawler," he said. "We've heard something of this, but we've been waiting to see just how general it was. You'll understand, now, why I was so eager to have you run last fall. You'll not escape so easily next time." Late that night, Lawler got off the train at Willits, and a few minutes later he was talking with Caldwell and the others in the Willits Hotel. "It is a frame-up, men," he told them. "Hatfield and the governor both subscribe to the same sentiments, which are to the effect that this is a free country, meaning that if you don't care to accept what the buyers offer, you can drive your cattle out of the state or let them starve to death on the open range." The big hanging lamp swinging from the ceiling of the lounging room flickered a dull light into the faces of the men, revealing lines that had not been in them some hours before. Somehow, it had seemed to them, Lawler would straighten things out for them. They had faith in Lawler. They had trusted in his energy and in his mental keenness. And when they had sent him to the capital, they had thought that the governor would not dare to refuse his request. He was too great a man to be trifled with. It was plain to them now that the invisible power which they had challenged was a gigantic thing, for it had not been impressed by their champion. Their faces betrayed their disappointment in their downcast eyes and in their furtive glances at one another. And at Lawler, one might have read evidence of doubt and uncertainty. They might fight the powerful forces opposed to them, and there was no doubt that futile rage against the power surged in the veins of every man in the group about Lawler. But there seemed to be no way to fight. There seemed to be nothing tangible upon which to build a hope, and no way to attack the secret, subtle force which had so arrogantly thwarted them. There was an uneasy light in Caldwell's eyes when he finally looked up at Lawler. He frowned, reddened, and spoke haltingly, as though ashamed. "Lawler, I reckon they've got us foul. It is late. Today's the 28th of October. Not anticipating this deal, we delayed the roundup too long. It is a month's drive to Red Rock, over the worst trail in the country. We all know that. If we'd happened to run into a storm on the Tom Long Trail, we wouldn't get no cattle to Red Rock at all. And if we winter them on the open range, there wouldn't be a sound hoof left by spring, for we've got no feed put by. It is too certain, men, and a bad year would bust me wide open. I reckon I'll sell my stock to Gary Warden. I hate it like poison, but I reckon it is the only thing we can do." The others nodded, plainly having determined to follow Caldwell's example. But they kept their eyes lowered, not looking at Lawler, for they felt that this surrender was not relished by him. Caldwell almost jumped with astonishment when he felt Lawler's hands on his shoulders, and he looked hard at the other, wondering, vastly relieved when Lawler laughed. "I reckon I don't blame you," said Lawler. "It is a mighty blue outlook. Winter is close, and they've got things pretty well blocked. They figured on the late roundup, I reckon. Sell to Warden and wind the thing up. That's the easiest way." Caldwell grasped Lawler's hand and shook it vigorously. "I thought you'd show right disappointed over us giving in after what you tried to do, Lawler. You're sure a square man." He laughed. "You'll be the first to sell to Warden, though," he added with a faint attempt at humor. "For I seen Blackburn and some more of your outfit trailin' about 1,000 head in tonight. They've got them bedded down about a mile from town. I reckon you'll be running them into the company corral in the morning." "Not a hoof goes into the company corral, Caldwell," smiled Lawler. "No." Caldwell's amazement bulged his eyes. "What then? What you aimin' to do with them?" "They're going to Red Rock, Caldwell," declared Lawler quietly. "The 1,000 Blackburn drove over, and the 7,000 the other boys are holding at the Circle L. I wouldn't sell them to Warden if he offered $50 a head." It was late when Caldwell and the others rode out of town, heading into the darkness toward their ranches to prepare their herds for the drive to the company corral at Willets. But before they left, Caldwell visited Warden's office, in which, all evening, a light had glowed. Warden's expression indicated he had expected the cattlemen to surrender. With shamed face, Caldwell carried to Warden the news of the surrender, speaking gruffly to Simmons, whom he found in the office with Warden. "I reckon there'll be cars now," he said. Simmons smiled smoothly. "Them that contracted for cars last spring will probably get them," he said. "I reckon the cause of all this mix-up was that the company wasn't imminent to play no hit and miss game. There'll be a day common when the cattlemen in this country will jump on you guys with both feet," threatened Caldwell. "It's a mighty rotten deal, and you know it." "Is Lawler accepting my price, Caldwell?" interrupted Warden quietly. "I saw a Circle L trail herd headed toward town this evening." "Hell," declared Caldwell. "Lawler ain't so weak-kneed as the rest of us critters. He just got through telling me that he wouldn't sell a hoof to you at 50. He is driven to Red Rock." 8,000 head when Caldwell went out, breathing fast. Warden smiled broadly at Simmons. "Wire for cars tonight, Simmons," he said. "But don't get them to coming too fast. We'll make them hold their cattle here. We'll keep them guessing as to whether you were telling them the truth about cars. Cars and fools are plentiful. Simmons." He got up, donned coat and hat, and put out the light. At the foot of the stairs, he parted from Simmons, walked down the street to the Wolf, and entered. He found Singleton in the barroom and drew him into a corner. "He's driving his cattle to Red Rock, Singleton. And he is the only one. The others are selling to me. We've got him now. Damn him, we've got him," he said, his eyes glowing with malignant triumph. Chapter 10. The Second Obstacle. Lawler went outside with Caldwell and the others. After Caldwell returned from his visit to Gary Warden, and standing in the flickering glare of light from inside the hotel, he watched the men ride away. There was a smile on his lips as he saw them fade into the yawning gulf of moonlit distance, going in different directions toward their ranches, an ironic smile, softened by understanding and friendship, for he bore the men no ill will because their decision had not agreed with his. He had not expected them to do as he was determined to do, and he had not asked them. Had it not been for the agreement he had made with Jim Leffingwell the previous spring, Lawler might also have accepted Gary Warden's price rather than face the hazards of the long drive to Red Rock. Warden's attitude, however, his arrogance, and the hostile dislike in his eyes had aroused in Lawler a cold contempt for the man. Added to that was disgust, over the knowledge that Warden, and not Jim Leffingwell, was a liar, that Warden had no respect for the sacredness of his word given to Leffingwell. The man's honor must be wrapped in a bond or a written contract. The incident in the Hamlin cabin had contributed hatred to the other passions that contact with Warden had aroused in Lawler, but it had been his visit to Simmons and his talks with Hatfield and the governor that had aroused in him the fighting lust that gripped him now. The ironic smile had faded when he reached the stable where he had left Red King. It had set in serious lines, and his chin had taken on a pronounced thrust when he mounted the big horse and sent him southeastward into the glowing moonlight. He brought Red King to a halt at a spot on the plains where the herd of Circle L cattle were being held for the night, with some cowboys riding monotonous circles around them. Blackburn had seen him coming, and recognizing him, met him near the campfire. The range boss listened, his lips grimming, then silently nodded. It was past midnight when Lawler reached the Circle L. He let himself into the house noiselessly, changed his clothes, donning the corduroy, the woolen shirt, and the spurred boots that he had worn before beginning his trip to the capital. Then, penning a note to his mother, informing her that he was going to Red Rock with his men, he went out and rode down into the valley, where the other men of the outfit were guarding the main herd, which had been held in the valley at his orders. Long before dawn, the big herd was on the move, heading northward toward Willits, the 20 men of the outfit flanking them, heading them up the great slope that led out of the valley. The progress of the herd was slow, for there was good grazing and the cattle moved reluctantly, requiring the continued efforts of the men to keep them moving at all. And yet when darkness came that night, they had reached the Rabbit Ear, where 2 nights before Blackburn had held the first herd. It was late in the afternoon of the second day when Lawler and his men came within sight of Willits. They drove the second herd to where Blackburn and his men were holding the first. Leaving Blackburn to make arrangements for camp, Lawler rode on into Willits. From a distance he saw that the company corral was well filled with cattle, and when he saw Lem Caldwell talking with some other men in front of the hotel, he knew the cattle in the corral bore Caldwell's brand. He waved a hand to Caldwell and the others as he rode past the hotel, but he kept on until he reached the station, where he dismounted, hitched Red King to a rail, and crossed the railroad track. A frame building, small, with a flat shed-like roof, stood near the corral fence, between the tracks and the big gates, and Lawler entered the open door to find a portly, bald-headed man sitting at a rough, flat-top desk. The man was busy with a pencil and a pad of papers when Lawler entered, and he continued to labor with them, not seeming to notice his visitor. Lawler halted just inside the door to await the man's leisure, and then he saw Gary Warden lounging in a chair in a far corner. Warden did not appear to see Lawler. Either he was facing the back of the chair, straddling it, his elbows crossed on the back, his chin resting on his arms, his gaze on the rough board floor. Lawler noted, his lips straightening a little, that in the movements of the man at the desk was a deliberation that was almost extravagant. The man was writing, and the pencil in his hand seemed to lag. He studied long over what he wrote, pursing his lips and scratching his head. But not once did he look up at Lawler. Wrestling with a mighty problem, Jordan? Finally asked Lawler, his patience strained, his voice in a slow drawl. The bald man started and glanced up. Instantly, he reddened and looked down again, leaving Lawler to wonder how it was that every official with whom he had conversed within the past few days had exhibited embarrassment. "Excuse me, Lawler," said Jordan. "I didn't know you was here. I'll be with you in a second, just as soon as I check up this tally. Caldwell drove in here not more'n 2 hours ago, and I ain't got his tally straightened up yet." Lawler turned his back to Warden and gazed out through the open doorway. On the siding was a long string of empty boxcars, plainly awaiting Caldwell's cattle. After a glance at the cars, Lawler wheeled and faced Warden, who was still gazing meditatively downward. "I see that cars came quickly enough when you ordered them, Warden," he said. Warden raised his head slowly and gazed straight at Lawler, his eyes gleaming challengingly. "Yes," he said. "Simmons finally unearthed enough to take care of Caldwell's cattle. There'll be more as soon as Simmons can find them, and he'll have to find them pretty soon, or his company will face a lawsuit. You see, Lawler, I ordered these cars months ago, got a written contract with the railroad company for them. They've got to take care of me. I reckon you knew they'd take care of you, Warden. You were as certain of that as you were that they wouldn't take care of any owner who wouldn't sell to you. What do you mean, Lawler? Demanded Warden, his face flushing. What I said, Warden. It takes gall to do what you and your friends are doing. But given the power, any bunch of cheap crooks could do it. You understand that I'm not complimenting you any. It was apparent to Warden, as it was apparent to Jordan, who poised his pencil over the pad of papers and did not move a muscle, that Lawler's wrath was struggling mightily within him. It was also apparent that Lawler's was a cold wrath, held in check by a sanity that forbade surrender to it, a sanity that sternly governed him. It was the icy rage that awes with its intensity, the deliberate bringing to the verge of deadly action, the nerves and muscles that yearn for violent expression, and then holding them there, straining tensely, awaiting further provocation. Both men knew what impended, both saw in the steady, unwavering gleam of Lawler's eyes the threat, the promise of violence should they elect to force it. Jordan was chastened, nerveless. The pencil dropped from his fingers and he slacked in his chair, watching Lawler with open mouth. Warden's face had grown dead white. The hatred he bore for this man glared forth from his eyes, but the hatred was tempered by a fear that gripped him. However, Warden was instinctively aware that Lawler would not force that trouble for which he plainly yearned, that he would not use the gun that swung from the leather at his hip unless he or Jordan provoked him to it. And Warden wore no gun. He felt secure, as he sat for an interval after considering the situation, and yet he did not speak at once. Then, with the urge of his hatred driving him, he said, sneeringly, "Cheap crooks, eh? Well, let me tell you something, Lawler. You can't intimidate anybody. My business is perfectly legitimate. I am not violating any law. If I have the foresight to contract for cars in time to get them for shipment, that is my business. And if I offer you, or any man, a price, and it doesn't suit you, you don't have to accept it." He saw a glint of humor in Lawler's eyes, a sign that the man's passions were not to be permitted to break the leash in which he held them, and he grew bolder, his voice taking on a vindictive note. "And I want to tell you another thing, Lawler. As long as I am resident buyer at Willits, you'll never ship a hoof through me. Understand that. You can drive to Red Rock and be damned. If you'd been halfway decent about this thing, if you hadn't come swaggering into my office trying to dictate to me and calling me a liar, I'd have kept Leffingwell's agreement with you." "Then Leffingwell wasn't the liar," smiled Lawler. "You're admitting it." Warden's face grew poisonously malevolent. He laughed hoarsely. "Bah," he jeered. "We'll say I lied. What of it? I didn't want to antagonize you then. Only a fool is truthful at all times." He laughed again mockingly. "I'm truthful when I want to be." He saw the frank disgust in Lawler's eyes and the desire to drive it out, to make the man betray some sign of the perturbation that must be in him, drove Warden to an indiscretion. "You're a wise guy." "Lawler," he jeered. "A minute ago you hinted that this thing was being engineered by a bunch of cheap crooks. Call them what you like, they're out to break you. Understand, you suspect it, and I'm telling you, you went around last fall with a chip on your shoulder, making trouble for Houghton and his friends. And now they're going to bust you wide open and scatter your remains all over the country. They're going to fix you so that you'll never shoot off your gab about conditions in the state again. Governor, hell, you'll be a bum before that gang gets through with you." He paused, breathing rapidly, his face pale with passion, his eyes glowing with hatred, naked and bitter. He heard Lawler's short, mirthless laugh. He saw Lawler's eyes narrow and gleam with a cold flame as he took a step forward and stood over him. "Get up, Warden," came Lawler's voice, low and vibrant. "You'll understand what I'm going to say a whole lot better if you're on your feet, like a man." Warden got up defiantly, and for an instant the two men stood looking into each other's eyes, both understanding the enmity that was between them and both seemingly exulting in it. "I'm thanking you, Warden, for telling me, but I've known, since I talked with Simmons about the cars, just what it all meant. My talks with Hatfield and Governor Houghton convinced me beyond all reasonable doubt. I'm the man they are after, of course, but incidentally, they're going to mulct every other cattle owner in the state. It is a mighty big scheme, a stupendous robbery. The man who conceived it should have been a pirate. He has all the instincts of one. But get this straight. You've got to fight me, understand? You'll drag no woman into it. You went to the Hamlin Ranch the other day. God's grace and a woman's mercy permitted you to get away, alive. Don't let it happen again. Just as sure as you molest a woman in this section, just so sure will I kill you no matter who your friends are. Do you understand that, Warden? Warden did not move a muscle. He tried to look steadily into Lawler's eyes, found that he could not endure the terrible intensity of them, and drooped his own, cursing himself for the surrender. He heard Lawler laugh again, a sound that sent a cold shiver over him, and then he saw Lawler standing beside the desk at which Jordan sat. "Jordan," said Lawler shortly, "I want you to vent my cattle. There is 8,000 head approximately. They're being held just out of town, about a mile. I'd like to have you give me a certificate of ownership tonight, so we can start to drive before daylight." Jordan's face whitened, and then grew crimson. He essayed to look up, to meet Lawler's eyes. Raising his head, and then lowering it again without achieving his desire, he cleared his throat, shifted his body, and scuffed his feet on the floor. At last, after clearing his throat again, he spoke, huskily, "We ain't ventin' any trail herds this fall, Lawler." Lawler stiffened, looked from Jordan to Warden, and then back again at Jordan, who had taken up the pencil again and was nervously tapping with it upon the desktop. "Not venting trail herds, eh?" said Lawler. "Whose orders?" "The state inspector." "Headquarters," replied Jordan hesitatingly. "Would you mind letting me see the order, Jordan?" asked Lawler calmly. Jordan succeeded in looking up at Lawler now, and there was rage in his eyes, rage and offended dignity. Both were artificial. Lawler knew it, and his smile as he looked into Jordan's eyes told the other of the knowledge. Jordan got up, stung by the mockery in Lawler's eyes. "Hell's fire," Lawler cursed Jordan. "Can't you take a man's word?" He stepped back viciously, pulled open a drawer in the desk, drew out a paper, a yellow telegraph form, and slapped it venomously down on the desk in front of Lawler. "It is agin orders, but I'm lettin' you see it. Mebbe you'll take a man's word after this," he sneered. Lawler read the order. Then he calmly placed it on the desk. He looked at Jordan, whose gaze fell from his. He turned to Warden, who smiled jeeringly. "There is nothing like thoroughness whenever you do anything on a big scale, Warden," he said. "This order forces cattle owners in this section to drive cattle over a trail without proof of ownership. We fought for that vent law for a good many years as a weapon against rustlers. This order leaves a cattle owner without protection against the horde of rustlers who infest the state. And the order is dated yesterday. This thing begins to look interesting." He turned and walked out, not glancing back at the two men inside, who stood for a long time looking at each other, smiling. Chapter 11. The Long Trail. After leaving Jordan and Warden, Lawler walked across the railroad tracks and entered the station, where he sent a telegram to Kepler, the buyer at Red Rock. Then he drew a chair over near the door and sat down to await an answer. At the end of an hour, the agent walked over to Lawler and gave him the reply. It was from Kepler, saying that he would be glad to buy all of the Circle L cattle at $30 a head. Lawler stuck the telegram in a pocket and went out, mounting Red King and riding through Willits. Darkness had come, and there were few persons on the street, and Lawler did not stop. A little later, he was talking with Blackburn at the campfire, his voice low and earnest. Blackburn's face was seamed with wrath over the news Lawler had communicated. "So that is the Polecat scheme they're runnin'," he said hoarsely. "I reckon they know that between here and Red Rock there is a dozen big gangs of buzzards which make a business of grabbing cattle from every herd that hits the Tom Long Trail." "Blackburn," said Lawler gravely, "do you know of any other trail?" "No, nor you don't neither," declared the range boss. "What you meaning?" he added, peering intently at Lawler. "It is mighty plain," said Lawler. "If we travel at all, we'll have to take the Tom Long Trail. It has been used before, Blackburn, by all the cattle owners in the section, before the railroad came. It hasn't been used much lately, though, and so I reckon it isn't worn out. You're starting at daybreak, I reckon." "Yes." Lawler looked straight at the range boss. "Some of the boys who are with us don't know the Tom Long Trail, Blackburn. You'd better tell them there are prospects for trouble. No man goes on that trail with my cattle under regular working orders. It is volunteer work. But you might mention to them that if we get through, the difference between what Warden offered me and what I get from Kepler will be divided among the men of the outfit. That will be in addition to regular trail herd wages." "That is mighty white of you, boss. But I reckon there'd be no backslidin'. The boys ain't admirin' the deal you're gettin'. I'm tellin' them." He took a step away from Lawler and then halted uncertainly. "Lawler," he said, "you've been over the Tom Long Trail. You know what it is. There is places where we'll find 8,000 head to be a mighty big herd. A herd that big will be powerful hard to handle in some of them long passes. And if they'd get in some of that timber, we'd never get them out. We've got 28 men. If we'd have an open winter, we'd likely be able to take care of about 3,000 head by watching them close. Now, if we'd leave about 3,000 head at the Circle L with 4 or 5 of the boys to keep an eye on them, that would leave us about 23 or 24 men for trail herd work. That won't be any too many for 5,000 head of cattle on the Tom Long Trail, unless you're figuring to hire some hands from another outfit." "We're asking no favors," said Lawler. "We're driving 5,000, as you suggest. I'm leaving the selecting of the trail crew to you. You know your men." At dawn the following morning, the big herd was divided into about the proportions suggested by Blackburn. The smaller section, escorted by 5 disgruntled Circle L cowboys, moved slowly southward, while the main herd headed eastward, flanked at the sides by grim-faced Circle L riders, at the rear by a number of others, and by Lawler, Blackburn, the chuck wagon driven by the cook. A portly, solemn-visaged man of 40 with a thin, complaining voice, the hoodlum wagon, equipped with bedding and a meager stock of medicines and supplies for emergencies, driven by a slender, fiercely mustached man jocosely referred to as Doc, and a dozen horses of the remuda in charge of the horse, wrangler, and an assistant. It was the first trail herd that had been started eastward since the coming of the railroad. To some of the Circle L men it was a novel experience, for they had begun range work since the railroad had appeared. There were several others, rugged, hardy range riders of the days when the driving of a trail herd was an annual experience. It was a harking back to the elemental and the crude, with the attendant hardships and ceaseless, trying work. The younger men were exultant, betraying their exuberance in various ways, shouting, laughing, singing, gaily bantering one another as they capered beside the cattle. But the older men rode grimly on, grinning tolerantly, knowing that the time would come when the faces of the younger men would grow stern and set from the ceaseless activity. The long night watches, the deadly monotony, and the 1,000 inconveniences of the long drive. Many of Willits's men were watching the departure of the herd. They stood on the street, in doorways, and in some windows were women. For rumor had been whispering during the past few days, and it was known that Cain Lawler had defied the powerful forces which were attempting to control the mediums of trade in the section. And there were many of the watchers who sent silent applause after the departing herd. They were aware of the hazards that confronted Lawler and his men, hazards enough without the additional menace of the invisible power, of which most of the inhabitants of Willits knew nothing. However, Caldwell knew. He was standing in the doorway of the Willits Hotel, and his face was drawn and seamed with gravity as he watched. Gary Warden knew, for he stood in the street in front of the Wolf, watching, his eyes glowing with malice. Singleton knew. He was standing near Warden in the grip of a malign anticipation. His lips were bestially pouted, showed yellow at the last minute. He whispered to Warden, "Only driven about half of them. Well, we'll take care of them. He is leaving before the winter's over."